as any clinician would be, I was very confused about genetics of pancreatitis, because genetics itself is a confusing topic, and pancreatitis genetics was a very complex thing. About 15 years back, I got involved in this because of association with another genetist at Hyderabad, Dr. Chandak, and together this was a journey over the last 15 years. So what I'll try to do is this to, because the fag end of the day, I know most of you are tired, and again, being clinicians, we don't want to go too much into this. So I'll tell you a story of how all this developed and give you an opening into the pancreatitis that we see in this country. About 30 years back, Michael Steer, who was then the president of the American Pancreatic Association, said that chronic pancreatitis was an enigmatic process of uncertain pathogenesis, unpredictable clinical course, and unclear treatment. 30 years later, it still remains the same. There's no change. The only change is that we have now come to understand the pathogenesis better. And the reason why this is important is that if you look at what is happening in the field of at least chronic pancreatitis, most of the patients are diagnosed very late. The treatment is palliative. The disease is relentless and progressive. All forms of therapy, endotherapy, surgery, I think are still attempts at trying to help these patients, but very often they do not. The only way to prevent this disease from going into recurrent attacks of pancreatitis or into chronic pancreatitis, I think, is that if you understand the pathophysiology of how this occurs, maybe in future we can do something for these patients. So our basic understanding came from this comfort theory that Professor Balakrishnan talked about. But what is strange is that when Comfort actually put forward this theory, for the next 20 years, nobody believed him. In fact, there are a lot of other theories that came up, but this was not taken very seriously. What he basically said was that all chronic pancreatitis starts as small attacks of acute pancreatitis because of premature activation of trypsinogen, and then this recurrent attacks of chronic pancreatitis would then lead to inflammation, fibrosis, and chronic pancreatitis. This was the basic simple theory which we now realize is the basis for all pancreatitis. But before we actually go into this, I think the physiology of pancreas is a very wonderful thing. In fact, nature has made it that all pancreatic enzymes are secreted as inactive form. For example, trypsin is secreted as trypsinogen. Rest of the pancreatic enzymes are all in inactive forms, and as soon as it reaches the duodenum, the enterokinase from the small bowel cleaves a molecule in the trypsinogen, making it active trypsin. Trypsin then activates the other proenzymes, and the whole cascade occurs in a few minutes, starts in a few seconds and few minutes, and it's amplified. So this is a fantastic mechanism that nature has evolved to see that the pancreas is protected. All the activation occurs in the small intestine. So this is the basic pathophysiology. But actually, if you go into the acinar cell, and let me just go into the acinar cell to show you what is happening here, that all the pancreatic enzymes are secreted as zymogen granules. You can see the small granules here. It takes about 4 hours to go from the central part here through the endoplasmic reticulum up to this apical area, and from the apical area it just takes 15 minutes to get out in the pancreas. So again, it's a very fascinating mechanism how nature has evolved so that the activity goes slowly to the top and then like a volcano bursts out so that the enzymes go into the tubule. But if you actually go further down into the zymogen granules and look at it, the trypsinogen that is secreted by the pancreatic acinar cell, for some reason 5% of the trypsinogen gets activated into active trypsin. So the inactive trypsinogen, 5% gets activated into trypsin. Now we do not know why this occurs. This is something that we don't have an answer, but nature has done it. Now if this is left alone, if this 5% is left alone, it will do two things. One is it will activate further trypsinogen, and it will activate other proenzymes. And this will result in pancreatitis in everybody. So this should normally occur, but it doesn't. Pancreatitis is a rare disease. Why is it that this doesn't occur? The reason is the body has two protective mechanisms, two very important protective mechanisms. The first mechanism is the so-called SPINK1 protein. SPINK1 protein is the inhibitory protein that gets attached to trypsin and neutralizes the trypsin. So this is the first protective mechanism of the body, but SPINK1 only neutralizes 20% of the trypsinogen, not the whole trypsinogen, only 20% of the trypsinogen. The rest of the trypsin can still activate, but how does it get prevented from this? This is because of, again, a very unique feature of the trypsinogen molecule, that it gets self-autolyzed. the trypsinogen molecule gets broken at this R22 site. R is where the amino acid is, that 122 site, the asparagine amino acid. At the R22 site, the trypsinogen gets broken down and forms inactive products. So this is the second protective mechanism. So there are two safety mechanisms why all of us don't develop recurrent pancreatitis in spite of some amount of trypsin being actively activated in the SNR cell. So how can you get pancreatitis? Now it's very easy here if you remember that suppose there's some abnormality in SPINK1 protein, so it's not protecting, you'll develop pancreatitis. Second, if there's no autolysis of trypsin, then again you can develop increased trypsin levels and then you can get pancreatitis. So these are the two safety mechanisms and two methods how this can actually result in pancreatitis. So what happened at this time when we started to understand the mechanism was that this technique of crystallography came in, and crystallography actually gives us a very good idea, a three-dimensional molecular structure of all these molecules. And this is the three-dimensional structure of the trypsin which came in. This is very clear. You can see the two parts, the blue part and the yellow part. These are the two separate parts. These two separate parts are actually stuck together here by at this level at 122 amino acid, arginine. Arginine is the amino acid which actually sticks these two moieties of trypsin together. So this is the trypsin molecule. The paper that Dr. Balakrishnan was talking about is one of the most important landmark papers that occurred, which was published in Nature Genetics in 1996 by David Whitcomb. What David Whitcomb showed is that in patients who have hereditary pancreatitis, the arginine amino acid is replaced by histidine. Simple, just one single amino acid is replaced by histidine. This is called a single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP. This single nucleotide polymorphism results in a major change, because what happens is then the trypsin molecule, which gets normally broken down spontaneously for autolysis, does not get broken down here. Just by one amino acid, arginine changing to histidine, this does not get broken down. And because it does not get broken down, you have active trypsin going on. So let's go back to SNR cell and see what happens. Because of this mutation, arginine going to histidine, this molecule becomes tough. It doesn't get broken down, activity persists, and pancreatitis results. So this is a dominant genetic phenomena, a single nucleotide polymorphism. It's a dominant phenomena, it's a gain of function phenomena. There are very few mutations which actually result in gain of function. And this is one of the example of gain of function mutation. There is a evolutionary basis for this. This time we'll go into this, but this is, so Whitcomb showed very clearly that this occurs because of this, but for every genetic mutation, it's very important to have a functional component. You have to prove it. You can't just hypothesize and show it in a patient, because you know that genes and environment have so many other factors. So what they then did was this very interesting. They created transgenic mice. You know, transgenic mice you can now create for anything, which had a mutant cationic trypsinogen gene. And these transgenic mice spontaneously developed pancreatic inflammation, fibrosis, and for a very small stimulus, they started developing recurrent pancreatitis. So this confirmed, this transgenic mice was a functional evidence to say that cationic trypsinogen mutation is responsible for recurrent pancreatitis. Now, this is how a typical patient of hereditary pancreatitis would look like. A markedly dilated duct, an young girl, 14 years, an older patient with large caliculus, very often going into malignancy. Now, actually, if you close your eyes and look behind, you'll think that this is actually tropical pancreatitis. Patients with tropical pancreatitis, which Professor Balakrishnan and Dr. Tandon have so nicely described, are the ones who develop pancreatitis at a young age. They develop large stones, they go into malignancy. Typically, you'd think this is like that. But at that point of time, about 15 years back, we realized this looks so much like our tropical, so-called tropical pancreatitis. I don't want to go into semantics now, but so-called tropical pancreatitis. So maybe the same genetic mechanism is acting. So we got together, and then in about 100 odd patients, we analyzed to see genetically if these patients have this type of mutations. And what we found, this is the first paper we published in Journal of Medical Genetics. What we found is none of these patients had mutations in cationic trypsinogen, none. And 50% of them had mutations in the SPINK1 gene. The 50% had mutations in SPINK1 gene, and these are electrophenograms actually showing this, that this mutation could be heterozygous or homozygous, there was again a single nucleotide polymorphism from A to G, so that what these patients had was that asparagine, which was there at 34 site, was converted to serine amino acid, so single mutation. And how does this affect to cause pancreatitis? This is again a structure to show you this. This is the N34 site, which actually binds the SPINK1 molecule to the trypsinogen. Now, when there is a mutation here, what happens is the serine comes, and then this SPINK molecule no longer binds to the trypsinogen. And because the SPINK molecule is no longer binding, there is free trypsinogen, 20% of it is free, and this can result in pancreatitis. So, we come back to the original diagram. So, you see that the two safety mechanisms, now one mutation here causing autolysis, decreasing autolysis, second mutation SPINK1 is no longer effective because of mutation. And this SPINK1 mutation is the one which we described first about 12 years back. And subsequently, again, there are several groups from our country, the three groups from north, south, and east, so on, all described. What was very peculiar is that 50% of all the patients in our country, either tropical, idiopathic, whatever you call them, had SPINK1 mutations, 50%. So this sort of confirmed that this was a major mutation causing pancreatitis. But there is a problem here. I'll come back to that, and we'll actually look to see if trypsinogen is a major cause in Western countries. What about other forms of pancreatitis? Not only idiopathic in our country, but what about true hereditary pancreatitis? What about rest of the? And we found that in none of these, even if you take the so-called hereditary pancreatitis that we see in our country, none of them had trypsinogen mutation. So there's something different here. If you actually look at human trypsinogen molecules, 2/3 of it is cationic, 1/3 is anionic. And there are some descriptions in Western literature saying that anionic mutations in anionic trypsinogen can also be protective against pancreatitis. So we saw whether this is present in our patients. Again, they were not present. None of our patients had mutations of anionic. So no cationic, no anionic. And there's a third interesting mutation that is present with trypsinogen, and this is so-called copy number mutation. Now, what this is that this trypsinogen gene, which is present in chromosome 7, is normally one from mother, one from father. But in some people, there is an increased number of trypsinogen genes. These are called increased copy numbers. Now, this increased number occurs because in Western population, this occurred as evolutionary phenomena. As the Western population migrated to from Africa to Europe, they started eating a lot of proteins, unlike the Asian population. Because of this increased proteins, there was an advantage to secrete increased trypsin. And because of this, there is increased trypsin genes in the molecules of these people. So we wanted to see if this was present in our patients. And this is a study we did with a French group. And what we found was a significant percentage of patients, French patients, had this mutation, increased copy number trypsin. But none of our patients had this. None of our patients had this mutation. So you see, in our population in Southeast Asia, and this collaborated from other studies from Bangladesh, Malaysia, and so on, none of the patients have had abnormal trypsinogen mutations. Mostly 50% had SPINK1 mutation. So is SPINK1 mutation alone enough in our patients to explain the so-called tropical canceric pancreatitis? The answer, of course, is no. The reason is 2% of normal population has SPINK1 mutation. So which means that 2% of population should have pancreatitis, which is not true. And the incidence, I think Dr. R.K. Tandon has shown earlier, was much, much less. The second factor is that SPINK1 is a weak protector. Only 20% of trypsin is neutralized. And the third most important evidence came in the functional evidence from transgenic mice which had SPINK1 mutation. And in this transgenic mouse, it was found that they didn't develop pancreatitis, they developed actually atrophy of pancreas. For these reasons, we feel that SPINK1 alone is not responsible. It is an associated phenomena. SPINK1 plus something else together can give rise to pancreatitis. So we started searching for what is that something else. And again, let's go back to the SNR cells. And this is a very interesting phenomena that if you actually look at the SNR cell, you have zymogen granules, all the pancreatic enzymes in inactive form in the SNR cells. And then you have the lysosomes. The lysosomes have scavenger enzymes. These scavenger enzymes, example is cathepsin B. They are separated. Nature has a mechanism to separate these two things. The reason they are separated is that if the lysosome comes in contact with zymogen granules, if cathepsin B comes in contact with trypsinogen, it will activate the trypsinogen immediately. And to prevent this, these are separated apart from nature. Long back, Dr. Ashok Saluja did some very good experimental animal work, showed that in the animals, if you actually produce acute pancreatitis and take out the SNR cell immediately, you will find that these animals, there's co-localization. The cathepsin B or lysozyme is co-localized into zymogen granules together, they're together. And so then he postulated that maybe this is the cause of pancreatitis. But unfortunately, this cannot be shown, and you can't take SNR cell from acute pancreatitis in a patient. This could never be shown. So what we did was, we actually looked at it in a different way. This is the zymogen granules. We took patients with chronic pancreatitis and looked at their cathepsin B in lysozymes, cathepsin B, and found that again a good percentage of these patients had mutations in the signal peptide of cathepsin B. And what does this do? If you have a mutation in signal peptide of cathepsin B, which is now in the lysozymes, goes and gets into the zymogen granules. From the lysosome, goes and gets into the zymogen granules, and this activates the trypsin and then resulting in pancreatitis. In fact, this we showed in about 20% of our patients. There's a link with SPINK1 also. In fact, there's an editorial by Markus Lersch from Germany who wrote on this, that finally the 30-year-old cathepsin B hypothesis has been proved in human beings because of this, and this we feel is an important mutation which is responsible for recurrent pancreatitis. Okay. So to make it a little more complex, we have another mutation. That is, in addition to spontaneous autolysis, trypsin getting autolyzed, there is another enzyme called chymotrypsin C, which also increases autolysis. And we have found that in again a percentage of our patients with tropical pancreatitis, when we screen for chymotrypsin C, there were significant mutations. So this is what we found. So let's leave the SNR cell, because all the time we have been concentrating on SNR cell and thinking everything starts there. Peter Hagi from Hungary actually drew our attention that there's something happening in the tubules also which may result in pancreatitis, because pancreas is not SNR cell. Pancreas secretory area is SNR, and ductules, the tubules and so on. So what we come to this, and this again very interesting, that there are three important areas here. First is there is a calcium sensing receptors here, calcium sensing receptors. Then there is a CFTR protein here, and there is a claudin 2 protein. Now the reason these are important is that when trypsin or trypsinogen gets secreted into the pancreatic juice, they come through the tubules, flows through this and goes into the duodenum. In the pancreatic tubules, the calcium concentration is maintained low and the bicarbonate concentration is maintained high. This is done by these three mechanisms. And this is important because the bicarbonate concentration high, calcium concentration low is safe. It doesn't activate trypsinogen. But if you increase the calcium, decrease the bicarbonate, trypsinogen gets activated. So what happens is, it has been shown now that if there is, this is what happens, the bicarbonate goes through the CFTR gene, which is, everybody knows gene which is also you get other problems with. The bicarbonate secretion goes through the CFTR pathway receptor, whereas the sodium and water don't go through that. Sodium and water go through the paracellular pathway, which is actually controlled by claudin 2. It's a tight junction protein, claudin 2. So these two can mix here, and then you get a sodium bicarbonate, which forms the alkaline part. And of course, the calcium is controlled by calcium sensing receptors. So this is the normal physiology. So what happens is when there is mutation in the calcium sensing receptors, a mutation that has been shown by Dr. Balakrishna's group, or mutations in CFTR gene, or mutations in the claudin, what happens is this would result in decreased bicarbonate, increased calcium, and that can result in pancreatitis. So these three tubular mechanisms, in addition to SNR mechanism, can also lead to pancreatitis. In fact, we have recently looked at claudin. Claudin 2 became very important after Whitcomb again published his studies in Nature a few years back, showing that this is abnormal. It's an X-linked gene, which is abnormal in patients with alcoholic pancreatitis. Those who have alcoholic pancreatitis have abnormal claudin 2. We have now actually just published a study where we showed that claudin 2 is linked to SPINK1, and in a significant percentage of patients you have SPINK1 in the SNR cell, claudin in the tubular cells causing problem. So this CF became important because of a study which came in New England Journal long back, but how important was it in our patients? And this is a study which came from Ish Bhatia's group from SGPJ, who showed that CFTR mutations were there in our patients, tropical pancreatitis. And again, this is, I said, work came from here. We showed that the calcium sensing receptor gene was abnormal. So you had all these abnormalities. In fact, I'll come to the last mutation, and this is again very interesting because this is a study that we published 2 years back in Nature along with Heikovic from Germany. This was a hypothesis that we worked on. There is a enzyme called carboxypeptidase in the pancreas. Carboxypeptidase secretion is the second highest protein secretion from the pancreatic SNR cell. 10% of protein of the pancreas is carboxypeptidase. So we postulated, can there be abnormalities in carboxypeptidase giving rise to any possibility of pancreatitis? And what we found was that in Indian patients, especially those with tropical calcific or idiopathic chronic pancreatitis, there was a significant percentage who had abnormal carboxypeptidase. But peculiarly, these patients had a mutation which decreased the activity of carboxypeptidase, not increased. So it was very paradoxical. And then we realized when we did functional studies, the reason was this. The reason was this abnormal carboxypeptidase, as it was getting folded, all the enzymes get folded in the endoplasmic reticulum. As it was getting folded, it was misfolded because of the mutation. And because of the misfolding in endoplasmic reticulum, it was producing ER stress. And this ER stress was resulting in pancreatitis. So this was the only other pathway that we found can give rise to pancreatitis. So finally, if you actually look at pancreatitis, either chronic pancreatitis, recurrent acute pancreatitis, every pancreatitis is genetic disease. And this is a hypothesis that we put forward recently. It can be either in the SNR pathway, SPINK1, trypsinogen, cathepsin, CHTRC, or it can be in the tubal pathway, CFTR, CS, or claudin. Every pancreatitis has a genetic basis. And that's so we also realize that if we actually take patients who have recurrent pancreatitis, there are some patients who develop 2 attacks of pancreatitis, 3 attacks, 4 attacks, nothing in chronicity. They don't go into chronic. There's some, especially in certain communities in our country, we have found that this occurs. So there must be some genetic possibility. There are some patients, second attack of pancreatitis, severe calcification, fibrosis, diabetes. So there seems to be some other genetic factors. So we postulated that this was a 2-hit hypothesis, that you can have a primary mutation which can result in activation of trypsinogen and so on, resulting in recurrent attacks of pancreatitis. This is the first hit. The second hit was that there can be second gene mutation which can result in fibrosis in some, calcification in some, or diabetes, and this depends upon the second genetic abnormality. And this is what we are concentrating now on. We have actually looked at several of these phenomena to see whether these mutations can now be worked out, whether there is specific mutations which caused increased fibrosis, increased calcification, and so on. So we realized that in the evolution of chronic pancreatitis, recurrent pancreatitis, there can be genes which are second gene mutation. For fibrosis, we looked at certain genes we are trying to now associate, but mainly they seem to be related to genes in the interleukin pathway. For calcification, similarly, REG1 genes. For diabetes, now we're finding some very interesting findings. In fact, we found that mutations in BEC2 gene can result in increased diabetes in this patient. So these are different things. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the problem is when you have so much of data coming in, how do we put it all together? It's so confusing. In fact, it's just like this R.K. Lakshman cartoon that it says that the scientist is saying that I invented a miracle cure for a disease that is yet to be discovered. So the cure has already come, the disease has to be discovered now. So this is something that we have been accused of, at least in the area of pancreatic genetics, that people are going on doing so much of microscopic dissection, that how do we put all this data together? I think it's important to realize that one thing that we have realized from all this is that pancreatitis, either recurrent, acute, chronic, whatever it is always has an underlying mutation, and the idiopathic part is going down and down. In fact, if you look at the biggest textbooks now, pancreatitis would be in the genetic area. Again, what do you do with reporting? For example, this is a typical report from our institute. If a patient comes with pancreatitis, this is in the research protocol, but if you have to give a report, you give a report like this, where we analyze, normally lab does 14 mutations. 14 mutations are given, some are positive, some are negative. So what does the clinician do with this information? It's very confusing. So should we send all your patients of pancreatitis for this type of genetic analysis, or should we limit it? I think it's very important to realize that at present, this is an evolving knowledge. We cannot take all this into account to treat patients. So what is recommended now, by the APA and other association is that genetic testing should be considered for those patients who have recurrent unexplained attacks of acute pancreatitis with family history or chronic pancreatitis with family history. So the family history we do that, or in those patients with chronic pancreatitis only, not recurrent, only chronic pancreatitis, but all other causes have been ruled out. And in those with unexplained pancreatic episodes in children, only in this group of people we should normally get done. Of course, in our institute, because as a part of the research protocol, we do for all the pancreatitis, but I think if you have to order 4 genetic mutation tests from patients with chronic pancreatitis or recurrent acute pancreatitis, these are the group of patients. We do not do genetic tests for a patient who has one single attack of acute pancreatitis. The reason, of course, is that we don't know how much environment is responsible, how much genetic mechanism is responsible. In fact, this environmental versus genetic is very confusing in pancreatitis. How much is genetics contributing, how much is environment contributing? So I once asked a famous genetist, how do you make out what is genetic or what is, because it's confusing. And he said the answer is simple. If your son resembles you, it's genetics. If he resembles your neighbor, it's environment. So that is... Of course, pancreatitis is not so simple, it's more complex. It's a complex phenomena. I think what we're understanding now is we're understanding the whole pathogenetic mechanisms behind chronic pancreatitis, and whether this will ultimately lead to therapy in this area is, of course, I think the positive attitude that one must have. But if you actually look at in 2002, David Lieberman, who was the president of the ASG, said this, that pancreas, which was an invisible organ a couple of years back with endoscopic ultrasound and so on, became virtually open to us. And David Whitcomb had to say this, that with all these advances in genetics, pathogenesis that we're understanding, it's possible that this gives us a hope that at some point of time, this hopeless condition, so-called pancreatitis, will be confined to the history of books. And we hope that will happen at least in our lifetime. Of course, before I end, I'd like to thank many of my colleagues. You see, mine was just trying to understand how this occurs, and the actual lab work was done by our lab, which is very active in this area, Dr. Chandak, Dr. Swapna, Shashikala, and others, and of course, other clinicians in this. And again, I'd like to thank Philip and his team for giving this opportunity. Thank you very much.